My name is Erin Blankenship, and I have the privilege and pleasure of being the interim executive director here at the Florida Holocaust Museum. And on behalf of our board of directors and our staff, I want to welcome you here and welcome you to our Pardoll lecture series. I want to begin by thanking our staff who are here making this successful. This was organized by our partnerships and programs manager, Miranda Brenner. And we have a terrific group of staff making sure everything goes off just right. And for those of you who might have friends who wanted to come but couldn't, we are recording and we'll be posting it in a few days. So tell your friends. I also want to recognize, I think I see at least two board members, Thomas Smith and Ezra Singer, if you'll raise your hands. Thank you so much for everything you do on behalf of the museum and our mission. It's very appreciated. Tonight, we are incredibly grateful for the support of Lois and Peter Pardoll, who've generously sponsored this lecture series for several years. We were just trying to figure out how long, but it's been probably at least, I want to say 15 years. So this is something that is dear to their hearts just as much as it is ours. And we're just so lucky to have you as part of our community and supporters of the museum. Dedicated to Holocaust and genocide education. And now I get to introduce our speaker. And sorry, I'm not just looking at my phone. These are my notes. Erin Farrell Rosenberg serves as a consultant to the Uyghur Human Rights Project on matters of international law. She is a licensed attorney in Indiana, specializing in international criminal law, reparations, and genocide prevention. She has worked at the International Criminal Tribunal, the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, and the ICC Trust Fund for Victims. She has also served as a senior advisor for the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Ms. Farrell Rosenberg is a senior fellow at the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights, an adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati School of Law, and a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of International Criminal Justice and the ABA working groups on crimes against humanity. So please help me welcome Erin Farrell Rosenberg.
So good evening. It's a pleasure and it's really an honor to be here with you tonight. Before I begin my remarks, though, I do want to say thank you to the Florida Holocaust Museum, all of the staff, and of course, Director Blankenship, Miranda Brenner, who I'm not sure if she has Miranda, and of course the Pardoll family for your longtime support of such important events here at the museum. As you know, as was advertised and as Erin mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about the Uyghur Genocide with you tonight. And this is, I think, a really timely event because it is almost 1 year to the day, in fact, today, that the Uyghur Tribunal, which was an independent NGO-supported criminal tribunal led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, issued its judgment December 9th, of last year, finding that the People's Republic of China, or China for short, was committing genocide against the Uyghurs under the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And of course, as you probably know, the Uyghur Tribunal is not alone in having reached this determination. In fact, it is almost 2 years since the United States reached the same determination on January 19th, 2021. The Trump administration and Secretary of State Pompeo reached the determination that China was committing genocide against the Uyghurs. We have a number of other governments, legislatures, and parliaments that have also reached that determination. However, despite these determinations, despite the condemnations that have come with these findings, the fact of the matter is that China's persecution of the Uyghur people continues unabated as we are speaking even here tonight. And, the world, when we talk about the Uyghurs, cannot say that it doesn't know what has happened, that it doesn't know what is happening. We do know what has happened, and we know what continues to happen, and we cannot remain silent. And that is why I so appreciate having the opportunity to be here with you tonight, to continue to tell the story of what is happening to the Uyghurs, to ensure that we do not simply become immune to horror and accept the unacceptable. So it is with those remarks that I would say that I deeply appreciate the opportunity to speak with you tonight about the Uyghur genocide. And with that, I would say, I've used the word Uyghur a whole bunch. I don't know how familiar you are with this community. So who are the Uyghurs? The Uyghurs are an ethnic minority in China. They are mainly Turkic Muslim. However, not all Uyghurs are Muslim. They are majority Muslim, but Uyghurs identify also secular Uyghurs, non-religious Uyghurs. They, in total, worldwide, they're estimated to be 12.5 to 13 million Uyghurs. In China, almost all of them live in China. So between 11.5 and 12 million Uyghurs are estimated to live in China. I wonder if anyone here, and you probably don't know the exact number, but you're probably aware of the size of the Chinese population, 1.4 billion. Earlier today, I had the opportunity with Sandy Merlstein to tour the museum. And one of the things that Sandy and I were talking about, and she said as a docent that she often speaks to students about, is she asked them, what do you think the Jewish population in Germany was before the Holocaust? And of course, I think most of us know, right, that when you ask this question, you'll get answers of 10%, 15%. And when you realize it's actually less than 1%, that's when I think it really starts to hit people of how vulnerable this minority group was. This is the same. I think that the parallels here are very clear. This is a population of 12 to 13 million people in a country of 1.4 billion. So the Uyghurs are very, very tiny as a minority group in China. Uyghurs have a very unique culture. They have their own language. They have their own unique and very noticeable style of dress. They also have a number of traditions that have greatly influenced, actually, not just in China, but also in Asia and in Russia, including Uyghur dance and Uyghur poetry. Uyghur poetry has actually played a very influential role in the development of different styles of Russian poetry. And they reside mainly in what is called Xinjiang province, which is in northwestern China. When I mentioned that the Uyghurs are referred to as Turkic Muslims, that's because of where they're located is actually close to what we would call the stands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, etc. And their homeland is what historically they would have referred to actually as Turkmenistan. So in Xinjiang, however, the Uyghurs are not the majority, but they do make up a sizable percentage of the population. Not 50% of the region where they're from, but it is a sizable amount of the minority. And I'm saying that because I'm going to come back to this point, that they are a sizable minority in Xinjiang province itself. And we'll come back to why that matters. And so that's just a little bit about the Uyghurs, who they are. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what is genocide. And I realize that I am here in the Florida Holocaust Museum. And so that might seem like a somewhat presumptuous thing to be talking to you about. But the truth of the matter is that what genocide is as a international crime is actually different than what is understood in amongst, I would say, just sort of the general population. And so I do think it's important, before we talk about how this applies to the Uyghurs, to just talk a little bit about what the crime of genocide actually is under international law. For many people, genocide is uniquely mass killings. And I think that this comes from the fact that most people are familiar with genocides such as the Holocaust, such as Rwanda. And so because mass killings featured quite prominently in those genocides, that tends to color how people understand what genocide means. However, we know that there are many genocides that are less known, but also have other features. For example, the Holodomor in Ukraine is a genocide that doesn't involve mass killing in the sense of mass slaughter, but rather the imposition of conditions of life meant to destroy the Ukrainian people by imposing a famine, starvation, slow death, right? And so that's just one example, which is actually an example of a genocide that doesn't fit within our sort of narrower version of what genocide is. So with that said, genocide is defined identically for individuals who would be prosecuted, as well as for states who are bound to respect the terms of the Genocide Convention as signatories. So genocide is defined as a crime in the 1948 Convention, which I'm going to give you the full title because this again matters, the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This is the Genocide Convention, which was, of course, a product of the world reacting to the horrors of the Holocaust. Now, the Genocide Convention, however, just to mention, is a product of the world reacting to the Holocaust, but also to other genocides, including the Armenian genocide, including the Holodomor. And we see that in the terms of the Genocide Convention. The definition provided in the Genocide Convention was adopted completely within the Rome Statute. The reason why I say that is because the Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court, is where people are prosecuted for the crime of genocide. For the Genocide Convention itself, a state would be brought before the International Court of Justice. And there the court would determine whether they had violated the Genocide Convention. Right now, Ukraine and Russia have a dispute about the Genocide Convention before the International Court of Justice. Myanmar has a case that was brought by the Gambia regarding whether they have violated the Genocide Convention against the Rohingya. There is no case involving the Uyghurs because China does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice for the crime of genocide. However, under the convention, genocide is defined in the following way. Genocide means any of the 5 following acts: killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. These 5 acts, any one of them, constitutes the crime of genocide when the act is committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So what this means, what we can see from the definition, is that the crime of genocide is basically made up of two things, right? You have the physical element, the act, and then you have the mental element. It is the mental element, what we call the mens rea, that differentiates genocide as a crime from all other international crimes. However, it's important to say this, that genocide is a unique crime in international law, but there is no hierarchy of crimes. Each of these acts committed without genocidal intent, if committed on a widespread basis, is a crime against humanity. It is not that they are genocide or nothing. Killing, the mass killing of people, even if committed without genocidal intent, is a horrific crime. Preventing births through sterilization, through forced abortions, is a very serious, grave violation of human rights, regardless of whether or not it is committed with genocidal intent. So I say this because sometimes we tend to have an all or nothing approach. And it's important to understand that these acts in and of themselves are incredibly serious crimes. And they become genocidal when they are not only committed, but committed with this very special intent. The intent not to harm the person, but to destroy the group as a whole. Now, just to break down a little bit, and this is very important for the Uyghurs, is when we say the intent to destroy, sometimes people say, well, what does that mean, to destroy? The jurisprudence of both the International Court of Justice, but also the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, which has tried a number of genocide cases, has held that the Genocide Convention means to destroy physically or biologically. It does not mean to destroy culturally. Cultural genocide has been held to be outside of the terms of the Genocide Convention. So what that means, for example, is that a process of forced assimilation, which of course the world's history is full of, replete of, that is intended to destroy a culture, but not to physically destroy the people, where the people remain absent, their culture absent their identity. That is an international crime. It is a crime of persecution. It can be a number of international crimes, but it would not be on its own the crime of genocide. Genocide requires physical destruction or biological destruction. Biological destruction refers to those acts that seek to destroy the reproductive capacity of the group to be able to continue to exist. So in the same way, you can have mass killing. If you have on a mass scale the prevention of births, you end up achieving the same form of destruction. One is physical, one is biological. And these are the two that fall within the remit of the Genocide Convention. Now, you've heard me say in whole or in part. In whole or in part means that, and this is again, I think important to understand, this is about intent. This is often confused. It is not necessary for genocide that the act be done in whole. The question is whether or not the person or the state has the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. The genocide, in terms of the Holocaust, does not begin or become a genocide at a certain moment of Jews having been killed. It is in 1942 where the decision is taken for the final solution of the physical destruction of the Jewish people that it is a Holocaust, because the intent is there to destroy the Jewish people. It does not require that this actually happen before we acknowledge that the intent existed. So when I say in whole or in part, the question is always, what do you mean in part? How much? Is there a limit here? What's the threshold? And what the International Court of Justice has identified, very much coming from the history of the Holocaust and coming from the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, are three different ways we can evaluate in part of how to meet the threshold. It has to be significant enough to impact the group as a whole's ability to continue to exist. So it has to have that level of significance of intending to destroy at least part of the group. And what the court has said is that this can be quantitative, which is straightforward, right? Numbers. You destroy enough of the group, you don't have to destroy all of the group. You effectively have destroyed the group and made it impossible for that group to continue to exist as a group. The second is what's called qualitative. Qualitative is where you target the leaders, the carriers of the group's identity, the group's culture. And you target them for destruction. And by doing that, even though that may be a limited number of people, it may not be from a numbers perspective, a large percentage of the group, but by doing that, you essentially destroy the group as a cohesive group. And the group is unable to continue to exist with its unique identity. One of the examples, of course, of this, and qualitative and quantitative in most genocides, it's not one or the other, but if we think of Poland, for example, right, and the Nazis making lists of Polish intellectuals, Polish academics, obviously the politicians. When we look at Ukraine, and we look all the way at the very beginning of what happened in February, when initially what was happening, they wanted to wipe out in Kyiv the leadership of the Ukrainian people, right? As a way of essentially breaking the spirit and identity of Ukrainians as an identity. So this is the qualitative, where you're really going after those who carry the identity of the group. And the last part is what's known as perpetrator control. And this is an acknowledgement that, in part, can be affected by the ability of the perpetrator to carry out the crime of genocide. What do I mean by that? Well, Hitler may have had the intent to kill every Jew in the world. However, Jews here in the United States of America were outside of the reach of Hitler and the Nazis. And so we don't say, well, look at all of the Jews who were not impacted because they weren't in the occupied area as a part of our evaluation of the Holocaust. Because what we're looking at is the area of the world where Nazi Germany had control and could actually carry out its intent to commit genocide. For the Uyghurs, what this means is that, yes, there are Uyghurs who live outside of China. But the question of whether or not the threshold of in part has been met only looks at that part of China, or China, where China actually has control over the Uyghurs. So it's not a get out of prison free card, if you will. The fact that people live everywhere in the world, and some can, thank God, escape the reach of genocidal perpetrators. Now, I do want to acknowledge that a number of organizations that have looked at the situation of the Uyghurs, before I start discussing a little bit what's happened to the Uyghurs, have come to the conclusion that they are more comfortable saying that these are crimes against humanity and have not determined definitively that they consider it to be a genocide. And I think that's important to point out. The reason why, though, is equally important. And that's because they've been unable to gather enough information in terms of genocidal intent on the part of China. Why? I'll tell you why it's not. It's not because China gave them a whole bunch of information and they said there's nothing there. It's not because of that. That's the opposite, right? In fact, it's because of a very serious inability to access information. China has repeatedly stonewalled and blocked and prevented investigations on its territory for these organizations to be able to gather enough information to make the types of determinations that they want. Now, in criminal law, we have an approach, right, where you can actually draw a negative inference at a certain point from this type of behavior, right? Unfortunately, for most organizations, particularly human rights organizations, they are not comfortable taking that sort of hardline approach. But I will say that for myself, I am comfortable based on the information that we have, based on what we do know, acknowledging that there are gaps, with saying that it seems clear that there exists genocidal intent from China in terms of the Uyghurs, and that there are clearly acts under the Genocide Convention that have been committed. Now, what are those acts? Let's just talk a little bit about, and let me just make sure I'm doing okay here. Okay. Uyghurs who live in Xinjiang, it has been described as an open-air prison. They live under a form of surveillance daily from individuals, but also at the technology level that is extraordinary and almost unimaginable. China has sent over 100,000 Communist Party cadres to Xinjiang who live in the homes of Uyghur families and who report daily on their behavior and their compliance or non-compliance. Uyghurs who are identified as being suspicious are detained for re-education. Over 1 million Uyghurs have been placed into detention camps for quote-unquote re-education. One of the reasons why we know this is, again, not because China actually denied that these camps existed at all, until incredibly brave people within China smuggled out the actual information, the police records, the police files of who was being detained, and importantly, why. So what were these things that Uyghurs were doing that were so suspicious? Having a beard, wearing a headscarf, having the name Muhammad, praying, not drinking alcohol. It's like unless we're all drinking alcohol all the time, it seems like a rather arbitrary thing to be suspicious about. The reality is that what was discovered when these lists were finally released was that it was, in fact, the very arbitrariness that leads one to suspect that it's not even about a security concern, but that a part of the detention is about pure persecution and harassment, because it is so very difficult to know what could possibly get you detained. Is it because you speak your language? Or is it because of something as simple as you have an Arabic book in your home? You can't know. And whatever the cadres living in their homes reported as being suspicious was enough for Uyghurs to be imprisoned. Now, the other thing that the files demonstrated is how suspicion operates from a legal perspective in China, which is that suspicion is based on your behavior. The second ring is the behavior of your family members, and the third ring is the behavior of your immediate community. What that means is that a student, a Uyghur student here in Florida, posting on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, voicing their opinion, perhaps mundane, perhaps, wishing everyone Eid Mubarak. Their family would be tagged as suspicious. Not just them, their family would be, and potentially their neighbors would be. So these rings of suspicion result in that huge percentages of Uyghur people are being detained. Now, simultaneously, the leaders of the Uyghur population have been prosecuted criminally. Detention is an administrative process. This is not, you can't appeal. There's no court proceeding, right? You're placed in detention. But they're also prosecuting Uyghur imams, community leaders, politicians, and sentencing them to incredibly long prison sentences. Now, in addition to that, they have criminalized the use of the Uyghur language, and a number of religious expressions are not permitted to be used. They have also put in place, and you're probably aware of this, a system of forced labor. Now, how does this work? If you do not want to go work in a factory, what do you think happens to you? You get labeled suspicious, and you go to re-education. So this is a circle, the way that this process works, right? Uyghur children whose parents have been tagged as suspicious, who are now in detention centers, are abandoned, according to the state. You've abandoned your child. So what happens to the children? They take away the children to protect them because their parents aren't there. Well, no, their parents aren't there because you put them in a camp. That's true that their parents aren't there. It's true that their parents can't take care of them. So Uyghur children are placed in boarding homes. Now, also placed in care centers, separated from their parents. Now, everything that I've described to you, you could say, well, that's horrible. I hear you. This is wrong. What exactly is genocidal about this, right? And I mean, feel free to say that if that's kind of where you are at this point of this is all awful, but you haven't described mass killings. You haven't, described what maybe in your head you're thinking you're expecting to hear for a genocide. So what is the genocidal aspect? And all of this is part of the same campaign, right? So more recently, Dr. Adrian Zenz, and this is sort of I think for me, this was the moment where I moved from crimes against humanity to a genocide analysis, was able to uncover and reveal documents of the central Chinese government's policy, which is known as the Policy Optimization Scheme for Xinjiang. It is premised, importantly for genocide, on the notion that the size of the Uyghur population is a latent threat to Chinese security without any other action being taken by the Uyghur people. The mere size and density of the Uyghur population means that it is a latent threat and it must be reduced. So what did China do? Well, the first thing that they did, how do you change population density? The first thing that they did is they started a process of mass in-migration of Han people from other parts of China. The second thing that they did, which we've already touched on, is the forced labor, right? So they started out-migration of Uyghurs. what they were trying to do by this, right, was to change the ethnic makeup of Xinjiang to make it less Uyghur. Because Uyghurs, under this telling, are inherently inferior and foreign to China. Now, this should evoke for you some very similar thoughts if you think about other genocides, when you think about the Holocaust, the way that the Uyghurs are presented as inherently foreign, inherently threatening, that just them being there, they're always going to be a threat that they're going to try to undermine the state. So you have the in-migration of Han, you have the out-migration of Uyghurs, but because of ecological and economic realities in Xinjiang, that isn't enough. There's only so many people you can import, and there's only so many people you can outport in this way, and it wasn't going to end up reducing the Uyghur population to the degree that they wanted. So what did China do? Well, that's the third prong of the population optimization scheme, and that is the launching of a mass sterilization program of Uyghur women throughout Xinjiang. And this aspect, the fact that enforced sterilization has been used and is being used as a means to reduce the Uyghur population in significant part in certain areas of Xinjiang at the prefecture level, the targets being set were for 80 to 90% of the women to be sterilized. Now, again, that doesn't mean that those targets were all met. And again, we don't have enough information, but we do know what the targets were, right? And we do know that the birth rates of Uyghurs has dropped precipitously. One of the reasons I believe that people are uncomfortable seeing this as genocidal is because of the gendered aspects of it. Because we do not necessarily recognize crimes, and even genocide for that matter, when it is directed at women. We are used to thinking of genocide as primarily targeting men. And so this is unusual. It is also unusual because there's not a war, and because it's being carried out administratively, bureaucratically. Women are, how is this being done? They're being told that they have to go to, that they have to go to the local doctor's office, to the local clinic, where they're sterilized. So a lot of what we have in our mind, and a lot of historically, the way that genocides have been carried out, don't match up with this, right? And I think that's a big part of why there's a hesitancy to see this for what it is. But again, I would recall for you, what is the fourth underlying act of the Genocide Convention? Preventing births within members of the group. And there can be no question that the mass sterilization of Uyghur women qualifies as preventing births within the group. Why are they doing it? Is it being done with an intent to biologically destroy the group in part? Yes. Yes, that is exactly why it's being done. To reduce the size of the group by a significant amount. To prevent future generations of Uyghurs from existing. Now, since the release of the population optimization scheme, more information has come out regarding, and this is from UHRP, and I'm happy to provide you with some of the links for this afterwards if anyone is interested. UHRP has just recently published its new investigative report on the forced marriages of Uyghur women with Han men. So this is another aspect of trying to dilute the Uyghur group, targeting women, by targeting Uyghur women specifically. I think that, I see that I want to leave time for questions. So I think that I'm going to stop here. But I do want to close by just saying that, as I mentioned, I do feel very comfortable saying that what is happening is genocide. And I also believe that it's incredibly serious. The crime of forced sterilization, sterilization when voluntary, when it's consensual, right, is an extremely serious medical procedure that causes life-changing physical and mental changes, right? That's when you choose to be sterilized. The impacts of having to be forcibly sterilized are incredibly important that we bear that in mind about the urgency of this situation. Again, whether or not you agree with me that it is a genocide, the crime of forced sterilization is an absolutely hideous and outrageous crime being committed against huge numbers of Uyghur women. And it on its own should compel us to speak out and to demand that this stop. But the reality is that it hasn't. And the reality is that the forced sterilization of women combined with the mass detention of mainly Uyghur men, the imprisonment of mainly Uyghur men, the forced labor of Uyghur adults, the separation of Uyghur children, all of this continues. All of this continues. And it is at some point that we do need to say it is enough and it must stop. Now, last week, and I mentioned this, I was at I was in the UK in London at a conference for Preventing Sexual Violence initiative, which is a UK initiative. And I was there with a group of women that I work with called the SEMA Network, which is a network of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, a global network. Women from the network is over 25 countries. We had 22 women with us from 22 different countries. And Irina, one of the women from Ukraine, was speaking about what it meant to her when Russia invaded Ukraine. And the first thing that happened was that her Sema sisters in the DRC, in Central African Republic, in Nepal, in Colombia, issued statements of solidarity, of support, sent her messages saying, "We are here for you." And what she said was that she didn't realize until she started receiving those messages what a difference it made not to feel alone. And that it's not just about how it makes you feel better, but how it made her feel stronger, how it gave her the strength to continue to work to support other survivors in Ukraine. She took that solidarity of those other women and put it back into her work. And so I guess that would be my closing statement to all of you, and I know that I mentioned this to you as well before I began speaking, is that what it means to the Uyghur population, to the Uyghur people, that I don't think anyone in this room is Uyghur. Perhaps there's one or two, but the reality is that you being here, you caring, I cannot stress enough how much it actually matters. And I hope you know that simply by hearing, simply by voicing your support, simply by standing in solidarity with the Uyghur people, that you provide strength to them to continue this fight to end the Uyghur genocide. So thank you very much. Can I start with the gentleman here?
Oh, good. Well, I think you convinced all of us about the applicability of genocide to the Uyghur experience. Trying to find a couple of positive notes, it seems that they would involve some sort of external involvement into China at some level, at UN or some other organization, for two options. I wonder what your opinion is. One is relocation. That's something that is in the conversation at all. Is there resistance from whom? And also, nothing, I don't believe anything ever changes unless there's accountability for perpetrators of things like this. Is there any plan or expectation or conversation about accountability for this issue?
Those are two really good questions. And I'm going to be really realistic, which is probably going to sound negative and not encouraging, because you mentioned encouraging. So I apologize. I'm not going to be encouraging. But I do think it's important to be honest about these things. So in terms of what do you do about the fact that these crimes are being committed within China, right? There isn't really an answer to that. There's no appetite at the international level. And I think it's very unrealistic to expect that there would be any type of sort of physical incursion into Chinese territory by any outside source. The question of relocation, it's actually, the conversation is very much on the opposite side, which is that what we're actually seeing, rather than an encroachment on China's sovereignty, is China is now expanding its reach, going after Uyghurs living outside of China and trying to get them returned to China. So one of the major conversations happening right now is about that, and is about really trying to figure out what mechanism, whether it's using the Convention Against Torture and making a non-refoulement, a non-return argument that that Uyghurs cannot be deported back to China because of the risk that they would be tortured. Unfortunately, that's not going very well, but there are a number of cases at the committee level, at the various human rights bodies trying to make that case, trying to ensure that Uyghurs cannot be deported back to China. It's one of the most serious, the transnational reach right now of China in terms of threatening Uyghurs, because of course you have to imagine Uyghurs who've been able to leave, right, are now actually seriously at risk of being returned to China, where they will be, without question, immediately placed into detention centers. On your second question on accountability, those conversations are also happening. Unfortunately, it's the same answer. China is a signatory to the Genocide Convention, but they have what's called a reservation. And this is a very complicated thing, but basically it means that they signed the Genocide Convention and then they put a little sticky note that said, but we don't recognize the court that would say whether we violated this convention. So they have a reservation to the International Court of Justice. China is not a signatory. They're not a state party to the International Criminal Court. So in terms of a court, an international body that would have jurisdiction, it doesn't exist at this time. There are, of course, always options under universal jurisdiction, where a country essentially can prosecute a person for certain international crimes, even when that crime wasn't committed in their own country or by one of their own nationals. But that would require, universal jurisdiction cases require actually having your arrest warrants acted upon. And I think it's highly unlikely that even if there was an arrest warrant issued for, any leadership, Chinese leadership, that they would be arrested by another country. So those conversations are definitely happening, but right now the avenue is still not clear of how to get there. But I agree with you that accountability is absolutely necessary. Yes.
I'm wondering, what connection do you think any of these actions on China's part have, if any, to Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, since that's going through Xinjiang? It seems to me like he really needs Xinjiang to make that happen.
Yeah, and I mean, first of all, I think that it's a really interesting question, and I think it's very valid, right? Because it's a huge initiative by China, and it's clear that Xinjiang itself is incredibly important to them, right? In terms of development. And where I question is the degree to which, how do I want to put this? The degree to which the Uyghurs in any way actually represent a threat to the initiative. And I say this also bearing in mind that one of the really interesting things about researching in terms of the Holocaust and reading some of what Nazi perpetrators thought and believed is that you do actually realize that for not all of them, but for many of them, they actually bought in, right, to these really deranged conspiracy theories about Jews, where they envisioned them in a way that of Jews being much more dangerous, much more threatening than they at all were. And so do I think that the way that China views the Uyghurs, I think it's a distortion. This is the line I'm trying to draw. I think it's possible that China does really feel like Xinjiang must be controlled, right? Because of the Land and Belt Initiative. Like it must come under control and the Uyghurs cannot continue to, push for separatism or any of these things. But I also don't think that it's legitimate. I really don't. I think that it is a fear that has gotten completely out of control. The Uyghurs do not represent any real, blockage to China. China can economically and developmentally, China can do what China wants to do without anyone's agreement in China. And certainly the Uyghurs are not, they're not able to prevent anything from happening, if that answers the question. Yeah.
There's a pretty huge population of Muslims in the world, and most of the Uyghurs are Muslim. Has any Muslim organization gotten together? Are they doing anything? It seems to me that might be where it would start, since they're targeted mainly as Muslims.
Yeah, so I think this is where you have to think of who your target group is, right? So Muslim organizations absolutely have been incredibly supportive. Muslim populations in different countries, absolutely supportive. Or let me say it this way, governments of Muslim majority countries, not so much. That is not a statement though on the Muslim populations themselves, where you actually do have a tremendous amount of support. Now, why is that? That's because of the role that China plays economically. Yeah. And that plays out, certainly that's a much broader statement in terms of governments with China than just countries that have Muslim majority populations. That's also true in terms of many of the Asian countries. It's true for that matter in terms of the border countries and the quote unquote Turkic countries that one would think would be much more sympathetic and supportive of the Uyghurs. Their populations, again, are, but the governments not necessarily. And I think that it has less to do with any sort of like ethnic or religious base and more to do with the alliance that I think we can kind of see between illiberal and liberal governments and democracies. The reality is that China is a dictatorship. There are a number of countries that, whether they're autocratic or dictatorships, align with China from that perspective as well. And so I think that is more the divide that you see rather than, from an ethnic or religious perspective. But I mean, I think that one of the things that I find very moving, very honestly, is the amount of support that I find for the Uyghur community from the Jewish community, from the Muslim community. There was an event with Rohingyas, who organized to speak out in support of the Uyghurs. And so there's all of this sort of cross-group solidarity that I think is incredibly important at the individual level, at the group level, at the organization level. Governments are a whole different animal, though. Yeah.
Just a question about kind of bureaucratic language of genocide. You said we don't have a lot of information about sort of what's going on, but I wonder, has any glimpses of what, say, a directive from the public health authorities to a gynecological clinic, any sense of what that might have looked like, or how would they know to do the things they're doing?
Yeah. So this is actually how we do know about it, right? Is that because China is so centralized in terms of their government, right? So it's not as if you have the ability. This is one of the really important things, right? Like, it's not like there's a renegade administrator in Xinjiang who's like doing this stuff and that nobody in Beijing knows what's happening. That's not how China operates, right? Like, these are orders that are coming from Beijing that then are, setting very clear targets. And so that's actually how it is, that kind of information, like the quota targets that were sent out at the prefecture level, which were then smuggled out to Dr. Zen's, where you could actually see all the way to the very, very local level. Why do those documents exist? Because of the extreme bureaucracy of Chinese government. And that's how they were able, and that's also true in terms of the police files, the Xinjiang files. Why all of those things exist is because all of the administrators, all of the lower level people are all reporting, and that's all going back up, and they're making a paper trail. Yeah.
If there is no statute of limitations for genocide,
Mm-hmm.
does that mean theoretically that we could go to the distant past, to countries which may have genocide,
Mm-hmm.
but no longer do, and prosecute them?
Well, you can't prosecute a country, right? You can only prosecute people, but
But I thought you talked about an action being brought against a state.
yes.
If China were found guilty of genocide.
Yes, which is not, just to be clear though, that's not a prosecution. So they would be found to be in violation of the convention. But yes, so the statutory limit for the Genocide Convention is 1948.
Really?
Yes. For the Rome Statute, in terms of individuals, it is either 2001, when the Rome Statute comes into being, or actually 2002, or when that country ratified, right? So a country only becomes bound by a treaty when they ratify it, and then they're bound by it. So because China is not a signatory, if China signed the Rome Statute today, it would not be backdated. It would mean going forward. And so the Genocide Convention, yes, is only from when the Genocide Convention entered into force. And then more specifically per country, it's when that country actually ratified and joined the Genocide Convention as a contracting party. Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about the international courts and their effectiveness in terms of prevention or punishment, or really just the documentation?
That's a great question. I mean, and it depends on so at the international level, in terms of courts, we have the International Court of Justice, which deals with state responsibility. And the International Court of Justice, only a state can bring a case against another state. People can't bring cases at all. Then we have the International Criminal Court, which is only for individuals, and it's only criminal. So states, you often hear this when people talk about the International Criminal Court. Oh, such and such state is going to be brought before the ICC. That's actually not true. States can't be brought before the ICC, only people. Now, one of the things about international criminal law and individual criminal liability is that we are talking about the liability of a person. They're not a stand-in for a state, right? So it is limited to their own culpability. So if you can prosecute the highest level, like the former president, like the former commander of the military, then you are likely to be able to have a criminal case that corresponds somewhat to the wrongdoing of the state apparatus. But if who you are prosecuting are more mid-level, you don't have that. And so that's something I think people need to actually be aware of, is that the ICC is not meant to replicate state responsibility. It is about the person. So you can end up with a case about this one commander who committed war crimes in a village, but that doesn't capture the rest of the conflict, right? So in that sense, what you mean by like accountability and punishment, it depends. And this is what we call micro and macro, right? For the people of that village as an international crime, the International Criminal Court absolutely delivers justice and accountability. And I think that's important to recognize for direct victims, that it matters just as much whether, a war crime is a war crime. A crime against humanity is a crime against humanity. The macro level accountability, right? In the DRC, the court has prosecuted, the ICC has prosecuted only non-state actors, right? So only at the lower level militia leaders, having brought no cases against government actors. Those non-state actors definitely committed crimes. Let's not pretend that they didn't. But I think if you were to say, in the macro sense, is that justice? Is that accountability for the conflict? Questionable. Right? Questionable. So it's a very complicated question. Are courts able to deliver justice at the international level? They are, as much as states are willing to let them. And I think that's the point. It's easy to blame the institutions like the UN or the ICC or the ICJ. At the end of the day, courts have as much power and these institutions have as much power as is given to them by the states that create them, who then complain about them being inefficient. And that's, I think, where, that's where we need to look to. Just to say, like the ICC is not able to prosecute the crime of aggression, which everyone was shocked and appalled about when Russia invaded Ukraine. Why is that? Well, because the states that are the states parties, it's not because the ICC is just a collection of states, and so now it's the same states that are like, oh no, we've created this impunity gap, we've created this accountability hole. Well, yeah, you did it, states. And I don't see I don't think that there's any real, I don't think there will be much change in that. States, the idea that there's an international interest, that a state holds a distinct international interest, I think is not true. I think states always act at the international level with a degree of national interest. Yeah.
Argument I frequently see online from apologists, is that the sterilization of Uyghur women is not that big of a deal because, after all, we Han Chinese did it to ourselves under the one-child policy. And so if we're going to do it to ourselves, well, then it can't really be genocide if we do it against Uyghurs. We're just trying to make you live under the same rules as we lived under. Now, this seems fallacious to me. I think it's kind of suspicious that at about the same time that they end the one-child policy countrywide, they suddenly need to enforce it extra strong in Xinjiang. But I'm wondering, is there like a more of a, I'm kind of looking at this as a layman, but is there like an actual legal argument there, and what is the response to that?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's something that I had the opportunity, I spoke at the British Association for China Studies, which was unusual because usually I speak with Uyghur-oriented groups, but BACS is actually more, I would say, Han-oriented because it's Chinese scholars. So it's many professors from China who teach in the UK, et cetera. And so it was, I'm not used to speaking in those kinds of environments. And I spoke with several Han women actually about this issue. So I'm really glad you brought this up. So it's interesting, right? I mean, the first thing I would say, and this is really about the way in which gendered crimes do or don't matter, right? What I would say is the way I would explain what had happened is that the Chinese government, not the Han people didn't do it to themselves, but the Chinese government committed a crime against humanity of enforced sterilization against Han women publicly, blatantly for decades. And the world did nothing about it. Now, if we think about crime deterrence, and if we think about how you develop your modus operandi, right? Your previous acts, right? Is it actually unusual? Is it not? If we were to imagine what country would put in place a genocidal policy involving sterilization of a particular protected group, a particular ethnic group? Would it not be a country with a long history of violating the reproductive rights of women? A country that has a history of using that exact tactic, not in a genocidal manner, right? But having developed a policy of not respecting women's reproductive and bodily rights, then yes, if you're trying to then think of how can we reduce the Uyghur population, I don't think it's surprising at all that we have seen this develop in China because of what happened to the Han women, because no one cared enough to speak out when it was happening to the Han. So for me, that's a crime against humanity that is shameful in many ways, that we talk about it in a very blasé way. We all knew about the one-child policy. Whether we were willing to really engage into what that meant for women is what I think we chose to look away from for many years. And perhaps if we had cared more, perhaps if there had been a more concerted effort to ensure that something like that stopped in China, it would not have been repurposed to be used against the Uyghurs. That would be my response. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Last question, yeah.
Very quickly, if China was a signatory, then what could accountability look like, given that they are such an economic superpower and just a major power of the world? What could state accountability look like?
So state accountability, so at the ICJ, for example, is much more expansive than what actually exists at the ICC. So at the ICJ, for example, the court can issue provisional measures, binding provisional measures, which are like an injunction, right? So you can go and you can get, or I don't know, I guess you can kind of describe it as a restraining order in a way, right? So you don't have to wait until the end of the case. So we have actually seen that with the Rohingya, also with Russia. Now, to your point, right? Okay, fine. The ICJ says, China, as a provisional measure, you must immediately release all Uyghurs being detained while the case is pending, right? Is China going to comply? Well, has the, Myanmar junta complied? No. Right? Has Russia complied? Have they withdrawn from Ukraine? No. So to your point, right? Like they don't have the enforcement power. However, and again, we're going to watch how this all becomes very circular. The ICJ is the court of the United Nations, which means that its orders, its judgments, but also its orders are communicated to the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council can issue binding resolutions, right, under its Chapter 7 powers, also to enforce, if it wanted to, ICJ orders. So theoretically, we actually do have such a much more forceful enforcement mechanism behind the court. What is the problem? China is one of the P5, right? So this is where it's unfortunate, but the reality is that the more you delve into the different pathways, what you find is that China has done an incredible job, actually, of really inoculating itself from being held accountable. And I think your question is very well raised of like, what would actually happen if they were a signatory? I don't know. I think they would probably have a judgment against them. Would that be enforceable? Would they respect it? And would any state insist that they respect it? I don't know. I do think, though, the one thing I would say is that we are seeing a development with the Magnitsky-style sanctions being used, which is unfortunate because it does in some ways actually really undermine kind of the international order of how sanctions are supposed to be developed through the UN system. But in the absence of a functioning UN Security Council, right, I do think that that if the court actually did have jurisdiction, that you would see more countries unilaterally and potentially even bilaterally or in some type of like multilateral setting outside of the UN taking actions, economic sanctions, visa bans, travel bans, etc. So I do think that that's there, but I think those states need something to hold on to. They need a determination that they can point to. And that's why the court not having jurisdiction is so problematic. Because it basically allows China to say, well, they're just allegations. Nothing's been proven.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Erin. I know I learned so much. I'm sure you all did as well. And I think we're even talking about having you back soon. So look for that. I want to thank you all for attending this evening. Thank you again to Lois and Peter Pardoll. And I just want to encourage you, this is our last event of 2022, but we do have a wonderful event coming up in January with the film The Survivor. It's a new HBO film about a boxer in Auschwitz with his son. So if you're a member, you'll be getting some information on that in the mail. If you're not a member and you'd like to know more about how you can get invited to all of our events and free admission, please talk to me. But thank you so much and have a wonderful night.